Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa DiFrancesco, and this is my presentation of the anatomy of the brain. We're going to start by looking underneath the skin, the periosteum and the cranium, and we're going to find the three layers of meninges, which are the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. One way that I remember this is the mnemonic PAD. Working its way from the inside out is the pia mater, arachnoid mater, dura mater. And it's also a function of the meninges is to pad the brain and protect it from injury. Other functions of the meninges is to provide blood supply to the brain and also allows space for the flow of CSF. So again, starting from the inside out, we have the pia mater, which means tender matter. And this is a layer of highly vascularized, thin and delicate connective tissue. And it's essentially shrink wrap to the brain, meaning that it gets in all the nooks and crannies of the brain, and it's very tightly bound to the brain itself. Next is the arachnoid layer, aptly named, as it is a web-like structure that is layers of connective tissue that are avascular. And finally, the outermost layer of the meninges is the dura mater, which means hard matter. And this is made of two thick, tough, fibrous layers called the periosteal and the endosteal. And this is a layer that's fused to the periosteum of the cranial bones. In between these layers of meninges, we have the cranial meningeal spaces, the epidural space, the subdural space, and the subarachnoid space. This is the one we want to look at, the subarachnoid space, because this is what fills with cerebrospinal fluid, and it also contains the blood vessels that supply the brain. So cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, the functions of CSF are to cushion the neural structures of the brain, to support the brain, and it also transport nutrients into and waste products out of the brain. The flow of CSF, the formation starts here in the choroid plexus. And from there, it flows into the third ventricle. In the third ventricle, there's going to be more CSF added. And then from there, we're going to go down the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle, where even more CSF is added. Then once that CSF is added, it flows out the two lateral apertures and one median aperture, and it's going to start filling up this subarachnoid space that we were talking about. So it's that space here, and it essentially bathes the brain in the CSF. At the arachnoid villi, or these little like hair-like thingies, where the CSF goes and gets reabsorbed back into the bloodstream via the dural venous sinuses. Now we're going to take a look at the brain, at the forebrain here. And here's the sulcus and the gyrus. So these are like the different folds of the brain. The sulcus is actually like the groove of the brain, or the valley, and the gyrus is more like the peak and the hill of the folds of the brain. So back to the cerebrum here, which is the largest part of the brain. And this controls memory, cognition, language, thought, judgment, reasoning, etc. It does a lot for us. And the cerebrum is going to be sectioned into two hemispheres by a longitudinal fissure, the corpus callosum. And this is going to separate into the hemispheres, the left brain and the right brain, which we've heard of before, where the left brain is more analytical and logical and rigid, And the right brain is more flowy and creative and imaginative. So the different lobes of the hemisphere, we're going to start with the frontal lobe. This is in charge of executive functioning, such as our judgment, our planning, problem solving, impulse control, decision making. It even helps make up our personality. This lobe also controls physical actions such as skeletal muscle movement, our speech, our ocular control. This is the area where the primary motor cortex is located. So the next lobe in the forebrain is the parietal lobe. This is where our somatosensory cortex is located, which controls touch, pain, pressure, temperature, vibration, proprioception. Proprioception is a difficult concept. This is where our brain tells us where our body is in regards to our environment, right? So it tells us if we're upright, if we're sitting, if we're leaning, kind of our sense of balance. Next, in the back here, we have the occipital lobe, where the primary visual cortex is. This is pretty self-explanatory. This is our vision center of our brain. And the fourth lobe is the temporal lobe. This is kind of on the side of our head here. And this controls our hearing. Here's another little trick for remembering the lobes of the forebrain. The frontal lobe is like the front motor and executive functioning. Parietal lobe is proprioception, pressure, pain, position, all the P's, right? The occipital lobe. So if you remember the OC in binoculars, ocular, OC. And then the temporal lobe. So if we think of the tempo of a song, we listen to music, so we remember our hearing. And the limbic region, which we didn't really talk about. So the next part of the brain is the diencephalon. The diencephalon is the next part of the brain that houses the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus is like the post office of our brain. It runs, it's like the relay center. So it relays the sensations that our body feels, the signals that reaches the brain, and then sends it out to the appropriate parts of the brain to execute the function. The hypothalamus is a master regulator, and it regulates such as like the endocrine system and the autonomic nervous system. The next section of the brain is the cerebellum. Let's go back here. It means little brain, but it's not so little in the fact that it holds more than half of our neurons. This section of the brain helps to coordinate movement and balance, and it also plays a role in our cognitive functions. The last section of our brain we're going to look at is the brainstem. And this is home to the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So the midbrain is between the forebrain and the hindbrain. It aids in motor movement, specifically of the eyes, and it also aids in our auditory processing and the visual processing, the eyes. Next, we have the pons, which connects our cerebellum and our brainstem. Now, this is the communication center between the hemispheres, and this is where sensation and motor function of our head and neck. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation, and I definitely hope that you learned something from it.